At 4:47 every morning, while most of the houses along the county road were still dark, a single kitchen light came on at the end of a gravel driveway outside a small farming town in Missouri. Walter Mercer had been waking at nearly the same hour for more than 60 years, and at 90 years old, he no longer needed an alarm to tell him when morning had arrived. His body seemed to remember the schedule even when the sun did not. Walt would sit on the edge of his bed for a few seconds before standing, giving his knees time to loosen after a night of rest, then pull on a faded work shirt, heavy denim pants, and the boots he kept beside the back door. In the kitchen, he poured coffee into a dented steel thermos, ate 2 pieces of toast, and looked over the small notebook he carried in his shirt pocket. There was almost always something written on the page: check the east pasture water tank, move a section of temporary fence, repair a sagging gate, inspect the orchard, pick vegetables before the afternoon heat, or meet someone coming by for hay. By 5:15, Walt was usually outside. On a summer morning, he might drive slowly toward the cattle pasture while the sky was still gray, climb carefully from his utility vehicle, and walk along the water tank and fence line before stopping to count the animals spread across the grass. Most people who saw him from the road knew the basic facts. Walt was 90. He still managed 100 acres. His working days often stretched from before sunrise until early evening. Those facts alone were enough to make people wonder how he did it, but they were not the strangest part of his life. The strangest part was that Walter Mercer did not need the money. His farmhouse had been paid for years earlier, the farm carried no mortgage, no large machinery note, and no hidden debt forcing him to keep working. Walt had savings, retirement income, and conservative investments that had grown quietly over several decades. Long ago, when a highway project pushed land values higher near the southern edge of his property, he sold a small parcel for far more than he had imagined it would ever be worth. He and his wife Helen invested most of that money instead of changing the way they lived. Walt could have sold the cattle, leased every productive acre to another farmer, parked his tractors in the barn, and spent the rest of his life without worrying about groceries, property taxes, heating bills, or whether the next harvest made money. He still drove an old pickup because it ran well. He still lived in the same 2-bedroom farmhouse because it was home. His clothes looked ordinary because he had never learned to measure success by how new something appeared. Retirement was not a thing he was waiting to afford. It had been available to him for years. His granddaughter Rachel knew that better than almost anyone, and that was exactly why she could not understand him. Every time she watched her grandfather pull on work gloves before daylight, she saw a man who had already earned the right to stop. Walt saw something else. He saw a farm that still had work left in it. People who heard that Walt worked 12-hour days sometimes imagined a 90-year-old man doing the same heavy physical labor he had done at 40. But that was not true. Walt had not defeated age, and he never pretended he had. He had spent the last 20 years slowly changing the operation around what his body could still do safely. His 100 acres were divided into several parts. About 42 acres were used for grazing a small herd of beef cattle. 24 acres produced hay. 14 acres were planted in seasonal feed crops. Closer to the house sat an orchard, a large vegetable garden, berry rows, and several small plots where Walt raised produce for local buyers. The remaining ground included barns, lanes, a pond, wooded corners, windbreaks, and the farmhouse itself. He kept 17 cattle, a number chosen as much for his age as for the carrying capacity of the land. 25 years earlier, he had kept more than twice that many, but when his knees began taking longer to recover after difficult days, Walt reduced the herd rather than pretending nothing had changed. He no longer baled every acre himself. A younger, local operator named Kyle Jennings came twice during hay season with larger equipment and handled the hardest baling work. Walt stopped climbing barn roofs. He never crawled beneath raised machinery alone. If a heavy tree came down across a fence, he called someone younger. He moved his most used tools to shelves between waist and shoulder height so he did not have to bend 50 times in a morning, and he added wider steps and stronger handholds to the machines he still used. None of it looked dramatic, but together those decisions were the reason the farm remained manageable. Even the famous 12-hour schedule was different from what people imagined. It was a working window, not 12 straight hours of strain. A typical summer day began with livestock and water before breakfast. After eating, Walt might spend 2 or 3 hours on light tractor work, moving fence, checking pasture, or tending the orchard. Around 10, he stopped for coffee whether he felt tired or not. At noon, he came back to the farmhouse for lunch and usually spent half an hour with farm records or his feet up in the kitchen. On very hot days, he stayed inside longer. By early afternoon, he was outside again, but the work could be a short delivery, a slow repair at a workbench, checking a gate, or gathering vegetables rather than lifting something heavy. His last cattle round usually came near sunset. Walt had learned the difference between staying active and being reckless. He had also learned to let machines carry weight his back no longer should. The tractor moved hay, a small cart carried tools, a long-handled latch saved him from climbing fences. He worked slowly enough that a younger man might have completed some jobs in half the time, but Walt was not competing with younger men. He was trying to keep the farm useful. That answered one question. It explained how a 90-year-old could still manage 100 acres. It did not explain why he wanted to keep doing any of it when he could have stopped completely. Rachel Mercer had been asking that question for years. She was 32, lived about 20 minutes away, and had grown up spending weekends on the farm. She knew how to drive a tractor before she could legally drive a car, knew which barn door stuck during wet weather, and knew her grandfather well enough to see things casual visitors missed. She saw how long it took him to straighten his back after working near the ground. She noticed that the fingers of his right hand became stiff in cold weather. 2 winters earlier, he had slipped beside the machine shed and said nothing until she saw a bruise several days later. To people in town, Walt's age made him impressive. To Rachel, it made heat, ladders, machinery, and falls more serious. She had told him to lease the pasture, she had suggested selling the cattle, she had tried to persuade him to keep only the garden and orchard and let another farmer work the rest. Walt never became angry. He usually listened, nodded, and gave the same answer. He was not ready. For a long time, Rachel assumed his refusal was emotional. Farming had shaped every part of his life. He measured years by calving, planting, rain, hay cutting, frost, and harvest. Helen had died almost 12 years earlier, and Rachel sometimes wondered if the work simply kept the farmhouse from becoming too quiet. Maybe retirement frightened him because sitting still would make him feel older than work did. That explanation sounded reasonable until Rachel began paying attention to his finances. Walt was not secretly struggling. The mortgage had disappeared long ago. The highway parcel had brought in a large amount of money, and he had invested it carefully instead of spending it quickly. His land had appreciated. His retirement accounts were healthy. He had few personal expenses and no interest in expensive travel, luxury vehicles, or a larger house. Rachel had once sat with him while he reviewed insurance and investment statements, and the truth surprised her. Her grandfather was financially secure enough that he could stop every farm activity the next morning and still live well. The old pickup, the plain furniture, and the worn jackets were choices, not signs that he could not afford more. That made his 12-hour days harder to explain. Then Rachel noticed something else. The farm made money in good years, but the money did not seem to remain with Walt. He paid expenses, maintained equipment, kept reserves, and then portions of the surplus seemed to vanish into things that were not part of his own operation. At first she thought she had misunderstood the books. Then one July morning, she watched him load 14 bales of hay onto a flatbed trailer, and the first piece of the answer appeared. "Who bought hay?" Rachel asked as she walked across the yard. Walt tightened a strap and answered, "Carter Place." Daniel and Emily Carter lived about 4 miles away on a smaller property behind a long row of cottonwoods. Daniel was 38 and tried to make a living from a mixture of farming and outside repair work. In winter, he fixed fences, repaired porches, replaced roofs, and took construction jobs around town. Emily worked part-time in the local school cafeteria and handled most of the family books at night after their 2 children went to bed. The Carters were not destitute, and Walt never described them that way. Their house was small but cared for. Their children had food, school supplies, and clean clothes. Daniel owned a pickup, a livestock trailer, several pieces of old equipment, and a tractor that had already worked hard before he bought it. Their real problem was that there was almost no distance between a normal year and a dangerous one. That summer, several problems had arrived close together. A weak hay season reduced the amount Daniel could sell. Feed costs climbed. A medical expense used part of the emergency money he and Emily had saved, and the tractor began making a deep grinding sound whenever Daniel shifted under a heavy load. He knew enough about machinery to understand that the sound probably meant money he did not have. Their county property tax bill was also approaching. Daniel responded the way he usually did when money became tight. He worked more. He repaired decks and roofs in town after his own farm chores were finished. Emily delayed replacing a refrigerator that had begun leaking water across the kitchen floor. They canceled a weekend trip they had promised the children and sold a small piece of equipment that rarely left the shed. They stopped eating out completely, even on birthdays. Daniel accepted small jobs on Sundays he would normally have refused. What he did not do was ask another farmer to rescue him. That was one reason Walt respected him. Rachel rode with her grandfather when he delivered the hay. Daniel came out of the barn as Walt backed the trailer beside a stack of pallets. He said Walt did not need to bring that much and promised he could settle the bill on Friday. Walt asked whether the cattle needed the hay. When Daniel admitted they did, Walt began loosening the straps and told him to come help replace fence posts the following week. Daniel immediately pointed out that half a day of fence work would not cover 14 bales. Walt told him it covered what he needed. There was no emotional speech, no public display, and no argument over pride. Daniel understood that Walt was not going to discuss it further and began unloading. A week later, he spent several hours on Walt's west fence, doing most of the heavy lifting while Walt measured spacing, aligned the posts, and handled smaller tasks. Rachel assumed that settled the matter. Hay for labor, farmers traded things like that all the time. A few days later, Daniel's tractor made the grinding noise again, louder this time. Walt happened to be nearby when Daniel shut the engine down. He listened while Daniel described what had happened and walked around the machine without pretending to know what was inside the transmission. Daniel joked that it would probably cost less to listen to the noise than to repair it. Walt smiled, but Rachel noticed that her grandfather remembered the problem. Several days later, she was helping him sort tax documents at the kitchen table. While looking for unused envelopes, she opened a drawer and found an old brown ledger. There was nothing dramatic about the discovery. The book was not hidden in a safe. Its cover was worn almost smooth. Several pages had been repaired with clear tape, and the edges were dark from decades of hands turning them. Rachel opened it expecting ordinary farm accounts. The first pages contained exactly that: fuel purchases, cattle expenses, seed, veterinary bills, equipment repairs, and hay sales. Farther into the book, the entries changed. Henderson, well pump, $612. Price, 18 bales, drought. Miller, fuel, $380. Crawford, county tax paid. Davis, 1 heifer calf. Porter, hydraulic hose and pump. Carter, 14 bales. Some names appeared once. Others returned years later. Certain lines had dollar amounts beside them. Some carried notes such as settled, work, or later. What Rachel could not find were normal repayments. She carried the ledger to Walt and asked what it was. He called it records. She told him these were not his normal farm records and asked why he had paid another family's county tax bill. Walt calmly said the Crawfords had been short. Rachel wanted to know why that made their taxes his responsibility. He answered that the county would not accept good intentions. When she asked about the other names, Walt gave a short reply: people got caught short sometimes. Then he closed the ledger and went back to his coffee. Rachel knew pushing harder would accomplish nothing that afternoon, but from then on she watched more carefully. She saw a young cattle farmer load several bales and later repair part of Walt's shed roof. She watched an older woman leave with boxes of produce and return months later with homemade bread, eggs, and a small envelope. A man borrowed a trailer for nearly 3 weeks. Another neighbor picked up fence wire and posts. There was no charity sign beside Walt's driveway, no foundation, no office, no application form, and no public announcement at church. Walt never posed for photographs beside the people he helped. In most cases, he did not even call the help a gift. He simply seemed to know who needed what, and he found a way to let them accept it without feeling reduced by it. The reason went back more than 60 years, to a season when Walter Mercer had been the one doing desperate arithmetic at his own kitchen table. Walt and Helen had married young and started with very little. They had an aging pickup, borrowed equipment, modest acreage, several cattle, and the confidence common to young people who believe hard work can solve almost anything. For several years, it nearly did. They woke early, worked late, fixed instead of replaced, and kept careful track of every dollar. Helen was better with numbers, so she handled the books. Walt preferred tools, animals, and fields. They slowly improved the place, repaired fencing, added cattle, and built a small reserve for bad months. Then came a dry season that changed everything. Rain disappeared when pasture and feed crops needed it most. Grass browned early, hay yields dropped. Feed prices rose because other farms in the region were facing the same shortage. Then a machine failed and used money Walt and Helen had planned to spend on winter feed. By October, the kitchen table had become a place for calculations neither of them wanted to make. If they repaired one thing, another payment waited. If Walt sold cattle, he reduced the feed problem, but also sold animals that might produce income later. Borrowing would carry them through winter, but start the next spring with another payment they could barely support. Helen moved numbers around in her ruled notebook until there was nowhere left to move them. They did not need a fortune. They needed enough breathing room to reach one better season without destroying what they had already built. An older neighboring farmer named Arthur Bell noticed their situation before Walt ever asked him for anything. Arthur was in his 50s then. He had a weathered face, an older barn, and a pickup that smoked whenever temperatures dropped below freezing. Nobody would have called him wealthy. He repaired work clothes instead of replacing them and used equipment long after the paint had faded. But his ground had produced more hay than he needed that particular year. One afternoon, Arthur drove onto Walt's property pulling a wagon stacked with bales. Walt came out of the barn and told him he had not ordered hay. Arthur said he knew. Walt immediately explained that he could not afford to buy it. Arthur answered that he did not need to pay for it then. Walt refused again because accepting help felt dangerously close to admitting he had failed. Arthur started unloading anyway. The argument lasted several minutes. Finally, Arthur explained the arrangement. Walt would use the hay, keep the cattle through winter, and settle what he could later when the farm had room to breathe. Arthur also let him use a piece of equipment he could not afford to rent and helped him locate seed on terms that would not bury the following spring beneath another costly loan. That evening, Walt complained to Helen about accepting so much from another man. Helen gave him a practical answer. If he sold the cattle because he was too proud to take hay, they would still owe bills and would no longer have the cattle. Walt knew she was right. Arthur's help did not make Walt successful overnight. It did something far more useful. It prevented one terrible season from becoming the end of the farm. Winter passed, the cattle survived, rain returned. The next year was not perfect, but it was better. Gradually, Walt and Helen found their footing again. A few seasons later, when Walt finally had enough room in the budget, he went to Arthur with money. Arthur accepted what he believed Walt truly owed. Walt tried to add more. Arthur refused. Walt insisted, saying he had never forgotten what the help had meant. Arthur told him that if the favor still bothered him, there was another way to settle it. Someday, another farmer would get trapped in a season that did not care how early he woke, how carefully he planned, or how honestly he worked. When that happened, Walt would recognize the situation before the person even asked. He would know that the man or woman did not need pity, a speech, or somebody telling them what mistakes they had made. They needed room to breathe. Arthur told Walt to give them that. The words stayed with him because they described exactly what Arthur had done. He had not removed responsibility from Walt. He had only prevented a temporary shortage from forcing a permanent decision. The farm itself became the source. Each year, the cattle produced income. Hay sales brought in money. The orchard and garden supplied local buyers. Feed crops reduced expenses. Walt paid the farm's real costs first: fuel, property tax, repairs, veterinary bills, hired seasonal work, fencing, seed, insurance, and a reserve for the next problem that had not happened yet. He did not pretend the farm operated for free. After those costs were covered, however, there was usually a surplus. Walt no longer needed that surplus to pay his household bills, so part stayed with the farm and part moved quietly into the kinds of problems recorded in the ledger. Rachel finally understood the logic one afternoon while they sat in the shade beside the machine shed. She told him he could lease everything, collect rent, and use his investments whenever someone needed help. Walt admitted he could. Then he told her savings only spent once and nodded toward the pasture. The grass, he said, grew again next year. That simple observation held the answer Rachel had been missing. Walt was not still farming because he needed the farm to support him. He kept farming because the farm was still capable of supporting someone else. Hay could keep cattle through winter. A calf could help rebuild a herd. Vegetables could become income. A piece of equipment could save a planting window. Farm profit could repair a well pump before a family borrowed money at bad terms. Productive land could create another chance every year. Once Rachel understood that, the ledger looked different. The names were no longer random acts of generosity. They were evidence of a system built one practical problem at a time. Mrs. Henderson's well pump had failed in the middle of summer when both her house and livestock depended on it. Walt paid the repair company directly. She later returned part of the amount in small payments, vegetables, and work. The Price family received hay during a drought severe enough that they had considered selling most of their cattle at the worst possible time. An older couple once fell behind on county taxes after medical bills. Walt covered the shortage before the deadline and allowed them to repay it over several years without interest. Another young farmer borrowed equipment through a planting season and later spent weeks helping Walt repair fences. A widowed mother received seed and fuel after her husband's death left the spring planting in doubt. Walt did not call any of these people poor. He did not ask them to perform gratitude. Most would have survived somehow without him, but survival under pressure can be expensive. A family might sell cattle when prices are low, lose productive ground, take a bad loan, or give up equipment they later cannot afford to replace. Walt's help changed the timing. That was what Arthur had given him. Now Daniel and Emily Carter were approaching the same kind of edge. The tractor finally failed near the end of August. Daniel was pulling a mower when the transmission lost drive. He shut the engine down quickly enough to avoid making the damage worse, but the mechanic who inspected it 2 days later confirmed what he feared. The repair would cost several $1,000s, perhaps more once the housing was opened and the worn parts could be seen. Daniel stood beside the tractor after the mechanic left and looked across ground that still needed work. He had several choices, none of them good. He could borrow again, but his existing payments left little room. He could sell cattle, which would produce immediate cash but reduce future income. He could leave some work undone and accept the loss. He could delay the property tax bill and face penalties. He could sell the tractor broken, but then replacing it would cost even more. Emily went through the numbers that night and reached the same conclusion from every direction. They were short. Their children had begun noticing the quiet conversations after dinner and asked whether they might have to move. Daniel told them no, although privately he was no longer certain. The next morning he drove to Walt's place. Even then he did not ask for money. He asked whether Walt knew anyone selling an older tractor cheaply. Walt listened, then took him behind the main barn to a smaller shed. Inside sat an older machine he no longer used often. The paint was faded. One fender carried a deep dent, and the seat had been replaced years earlier, but the engine was sound and the tractor still worked. Walt told Daniel to use it through the season. Daniel refused immediately because he could not afford another rental. Walt said he was not renting it. Daniel told him he would not take a tractor for free. Walt answered by listing several jobs he had been postponing because they required more strength than he wanted to admit he had lost. A section of fence near the pond needed rebuilding. 2 heavy gates had to be rehung. Brush had grown into a drainage ditch Walt could no longer clear safely. Daniel understood what the older farmer was offering. He could exchange labor for machine use. It gave him a way to say yes. Rachel knew the exchange was not financially equal. The value of using a working tractor through critical weeks was far greater than several days of labor. Walt knew that too. Fairness, in his mind, did not always mean making both sides equal down to the last dollar. Sometimes it meant designing an arrangement that allowed a proud person to keep standing while receiving the room he needed. For several weeks, the arrangement worked. Daniel used Walt's tractor during critical hours and returned it when Walt needed it. He rebuilt the pond fence, rehung the gates, cleared the drainage ditch, and helped move several heavy items Walt had been avoiding. The borrowed tractor solved an urgent problem, but it did not erase the rest. Their own machine still needed repair. Feed costs remained high. The tax deadline moved closer. Daniel took more evening work. Emily cut expenses again. Their children stopped asking about the canceled trip and began helping more around the farm without being told. The situation made Rachel uncomfortable for a new reason. She had always worried that Walt worked too hard for himself. Now she realized he was willing to keep working in order to carry part of other people's risk. One evening, she asked how much he planned to do. Walt said he did not know. She told him he could not save every farm in the county. He agreed. She reminded him that he was 90. Walt answered that he had not forgotten. Rachel did not laugh. She asked when he would allow himself to stop. The question forced Walt to explain something she had missed. He had already stopped doing far more than she realized. The final bridge for the Carter family was surprisingly small compared with the scale of what they stood to lose. Walt did not pay off their debts or buy them a new tractor. He made a modest, no-interest advance to cover one urgent expense before it turned into a larger problem. The hay reduced another cost. The borrowed tractor kept their field work moving. Daniel and Emily handled the rest. Winter was difficult, but they reached spring without selling their land or most of their cattle. Daniel took steady repair work during the colder months. Their own tractor was eventually repaired with a mix of saved money, outside work, and a payment plan arranged with the mechanic. The next growing season was better. Not extraordinary, better. They rebuilt part of their emergency savings. Their children stayed in the same school. The leaking refrigerator was finally replaced. The roof over the back room received the repair Emily had postponed. A few months later, Daniel came to Walt's farmhouse carrying an envelope. He explained that it was not everything he owed. Walt counted the money and said it was enough for then. Daniel promised to bring the rest. Walt told him he expected him to. Daniel looked almost surprised. Walt never believed generosity required pretending debts did not exist. Responsibility mattered. Work mattered. Repayment mattered when repayment was possible. Timing mattered too. Before Daniel left, Walt asked whether he remembered what that difficult year had felt like. Daniel said he did. Walt told him to remember it because sooner or later somebody else would have a year like that. Daniel understood. The lesson had traveled farther than the original "Hey, Arthur" Bell once brought to a young Walter Mercer. Arthur helped Walt without embarrassing him. Walt and Helen spent decades turning that kindness into practical help for other families. Now Daniel Carter had experienced the same thing from the other side. Someday he might see another farmer standing beside a broken machine, staring at a feed bill, or doing the same desperate arithmetic at a kitchen table. When that happened, he would recognize the situation before the person asked. The Carter children understood more than Daniel and Emily expected. Their oldest was old enough to notice that Walt's tractor had appeared at exactly the moment their own machine stopped. Daniel told him it was a trade, which was true, but not the whole truth. Months later, when the boy asked why Walt had agreed to such a generous exchange, Daniel told him that years ago someone had once done something similar for Walt. The boy asked whether that meant they owed Walt forever. Daniel said no. They owed what they had agreed to repay. The rest meant paying attention when somebody else had a bad year. By autumn, Rachel had stopped asking why her grandfather refused to retire. She had begun asking a harder question: what happened to all of this when Walt could no longer get up before sunrise? The arrangement had never become a formal charity. There was no office, staff, or large fund carrying the Mercer name. There was only a 100-acre farm, a worn ledger, decades of relationships, and an elderly man who had learned to notice the difference between someone wanting an easier life and someone who had done nearly everything right but needed more time. Rachel began discussing the future with Walt. She expected him to insist the farm must remain exactly as it was, with the same number of cattle and the same morning routine. Instead, he surprised her. Walt knew land changed, markets changed, families changed. He did not care whether there were always 17 cattle or 24 acres of hay. He cared about the purpose. The 100 acres had once supported his young family. Later, they supported him and Helen. Now they helped create second chances for other working people. As long as the property could keep producing something useful, Walt saw no reason that purpose had to disappear when he did. Rachel began organizing the ledger more carefully, not to turn every favor into a formal debt, but to understand the pattern. Several weeks after his 90th birthday, the kitchen light came on at 4:49 in the morning, 2 minutes later than usual. Walt poured coffee into the same dented thermos and placed the brown ledger beside it. Outside, cattle were waiting near the fence. Hay stood thick in the lower field. The orchard would need picking before another hot afternoon, and a gate Daniel had recently rehung closed cleanly for the first time in years. Far down the road, the Carter family's repaired tractor was already back at work. Walt stepped onto the porch and stood there for a moment before beginning his morning round. At 90, he knew there would eventually be a day when somebody else checked the water tank, moved the temporary fence, looked over the cattle, and turned on the barn light. The thought no longer frightened him the way Rachel once believed it did. For most of Walter Mercer's life, he had worked because his own family needed the farm. At 90, that was no longer true. He had enough money, enough savings, enough land value, and enough security to have stopped years earlier. But somewhere nearby, there was usually another hard-working family for whom one broken tractor, one dry summer, one medical expense, or one badly timed payment could undo years of careful effort. Walt could not solve every problem, and he never tried. What he could do was keep 100 acres productive enough to occasionally give somebody the same thing Arthur Bell had once given him when he was young, proud, and running out of options. It was not wealth, it was not rescue, it was time. And for as long as Walter Mercer could still help his farm produce that, he believed there was work worth getting up for.